All right. Welcome, everybody, for what is guaranteed to be a very interesting podcast episode. Not only because we have a very interesting guest today, also, some of you know that I had a angle grinding accident with my computer. So we are running a different software today, and I apologize for any hiccups that I hope we will not have. My guest today, as you can see, is Martin Owens. He is the primary developer, but not originator of a software called Inkscape. We're going to get into Inkscape. But more than that, we're going to explore a topic that I've become more and more interested in as I've become deeper and deeper down the rabbit hole of 3D printing, which is open source as a business model. Does it work? How can we support people who create open source projects? And what are the things that the software industry has already learned that the open source hardware industry is now learning? Martin, welcome.
Thank you, Jonathan. Thank you for a great intro. Yeah, I should make it clear that I am one of a bunch of developers who all work on the Inkscape project, some of which are volunteers, others are paid to work on it. So it's a real mix of individuals that get to contribute to the project.
Awesome. And I'm really excited to hear, again, like I said, you all have figured out a lot of things that I think open source hardware is just now figuring out. I think you're 10, 15, maybe 20 years ahead of us. And I do want to get into that. First, I want to get to know you, though, Martin. Tell us a little bit about your background. Have you always been a developer? When did you become interested in creative software like Inkscape? We'll get into what Inkscape does. So tell us about
Yeah.
you.
Yeah, so I'm a programmer, and I basically have been one my entire life. I started work at 16 as a programmer, and I've basically been an industry boy for my entire career. I started doing free and open source work when I was about 18, and I've basically been inside the community ever since. I started developing Inkscape in earnest in probably 2007, 2008, and I've been developing Inkscape ever since then. But I've worked on many other projects as well. Briefly with Ubuntu, I've been involved with a lot of stuff you probably haven't heard of with Python libraries. So like just a lot of different things. With graphics, getting into graphics, I've always been interested in computer-generated graphics and the software that's used to create them. It's a very interesting field for somebody who wants to be involved in creativity at the same time as being involved in the analytics of programming.
Mm-hmm. So it strikes me as an entrepreneur, I always pay attention to these things because I think we all put people in boxes. It strikes me that you've kind of always been a free agent. Like I didn't hear any, oh, I spent 20 years at Adobe in your bio there. Have you always been kind of self-employed, independent, independently employed?
Ever since about 2007, yeah. I mean, for a long time now, I have been basically an independent contractor. I don't contract as a worker for a big company. Most of my clients are small, medium-sized businesses who need basically modifications to free software, or they need help, training, and other things that kind of get them into the open source world so they understand it better. Depending upon the client needs, I can deliver various services.
Got you. Tell us about Inkscape, because already Tyler in the comments says, what an interesting, unexpected, but completely appropriate guest. I use Inkscape on occasion in my workflow whenever I use an SVG to create a feature in Fusion or SolidWorks. So for the uninitiated, I am one of them. I'm not looking down on anyone. Fill us in on Inkscape. I know Inkscape can do some interesting things with graphics and SVGs, but I know that it's also way more than I realize.
Yeah, so Inkscape is a vector image editor, which basically means that it creates graphics, two-dimensional graphics on the screen by interpreting mathematical instructions on how lines and shapes are drawn and filled. Obviously, these instructions can become very complicated, and very many of our users are artists who want to create very visually appealing artworks. But a lot of our users are also using things like CNC machines and other kinds of machinery that basically use those same instructions in order to do milling and cutting and other various operations.
So I can use Inkscape to create SVGs, vector images, right? And I imagine I can also use it to convert images to vectors and kind of gain more control over the images that I want to work with. If, for example, I want to pull it into Fusion or SolidWorks,
Yep.
recently, I think probably Inkscape has gotten a boost in traffic because Bamboo Lab and their slicer, as well as Orca slicer, now allow you, and I think Prusa slicer, all the slicers, I'm pretty sure, now allow you to import an SVG and turn that into a 3D feature, embossed or debossed on your model. So SVGs are much more important to us in 3D printing now for customization, for adding things and features.
Yeah, I mean, apart from the restriction that it's two-dimensional, the actual data itself is a fairly well-trodden standard. The actual path making mathematics is pretty much the same that you will see in a PDF file. It's pretty much the same that you'll see in a lot of formats like DXF. There are semantic differences, but the actual numbers that end up in the calculations that go into how to deal with those is pretty much the same. So as long as you can open up an XML file, your program, and you can parse out the data that you need, for instance, paths, then there's no reason why even a small and consumer grade machine shouldn't be able to parse out an SVG.
Right.
I actually have a Brother Scan and Cut, which can take an SVG directly and use it to cut and draw.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and like I said, so SVGs and obviously Inkscape is working in 2D. I don't think many people realize, and I don't know how into 3D printing you are, or if you're more on the side of 2D, which is fine. We'll get you there. But many people don't realize that, yeah, now you can import an SVG into your slicer. If, say, I have something and I just want to emboss my logo. I recently did it because I wanted to brand some of the parts of my printer. And I of course, don't have it here when I want to show it. But you literally just pull in the SVG, right? My designer who designed my logo gave me an SVG. You pop it into the slicer and it'll handle the 3D part for you. You can tell it to use the curvature. So if it happens to come right on a curve and I want the logo across here, it will handle that for you. So the 3D printing slicers have now taken the 2G of SVG, and we can, I mean, do anything with it. You can make its own object. You can emboss it, deboss it. So really, really exciting.
I mean,
Time.
one of the advantages of I think SVG and Inkscape specifically, and this is something that people sometimes confuse, is like you have editors who open files and then they have an internal memory format that's different from the actual file. So every time they save or open stuff, they're exporting it. Inkscape works by actually holding the SVG document internally. It is an SVG editor, right? It doesn't have any other internal memory representation. And using that as a basis for the editor as a standard that was published in 2001, so it's a very well understood format, means that many companies, commercial and other open source projects, can use the same files, right? You produce them in Inkscape. We know exactly how to produce them. And then other programs can open them because they don't have to read Inkscape's code base. We don't have to document further the format. This is very much unlike, for instance, Krita or Blender. All of these programs have their own quote unquote proprietary files that you would have to be able to unpick if you wanted to be able to extract the data. But with Inkscape, that's not the case.
So this is why, I wondered why SVG, why Bamboo Lab has on their website now, you can import an SVG and make a sign automatically. And all these tools, like I said, the slicers, I was wondering why it was SVG and not some other format. And you're saying it's such a open, wide standard that's just direct mathematics to 2D, and then in our case, being able to convert it to 3D.
Exactly, with extrusions and stuff. And it's the same thing that happens in Blender, right? You're doing a 3D model, you're doing a film, and you want to do some graphics. Many users using Inkscape for those steps because they can basically import that data. Yeah.
Okay, I didn't know that. So you mentioned something that I think is going to be really interesting for this discussion, which is there are some people working full-time on Inkscape that are salaried. There's tons of people all over the world. It's an open source program.
Yep. Yeah.
How does all that work?
So Inkscape is considered a multi-stakeholder free and open source project. So the organization itself is a non-profit held by the Software Freedom Conservancy. They look after the brand and the organizational infrastructure for the project. The actual people that do the work are not hired by the charity. Sometimes the charity will have jobs, contracts, but it's mostly external companies and individuals that basically get involved into that central linchpin, right? So if you're a company that wants Inkscape to do something or wants to improve it in some specific way, you can either get one of your employees or you can hire a contractor to do the work. Right?
Got it.
Some of the work that I do for clients is to basically do that work of editing Inkscape in the very specific ways that they want. Sometimes that work is so specific that it's not really useful for the public version of Inkscape. The code still gets published because of the GPL, but it's just not integrated because it's just not helpful. But in many other cases, and I would say most cases, the work that I do for clients that they pay me, it then gets integrated into Inkscape itself, and in the next version of Inkscape, the whole world gets to basically enjoy the fruits of that money.
Mm-hmm. And then they pay you directly. Tell me if I'm going too deep into the economics. I just want to understand, and feel free not to answer. But does the charity, you said that they kind of handle the organizational aspect. Do they get in the middle and handle that billing for you, or you work directly with the client?
No, I work directly with clients. So the idea is that the organizational infrastructure is supposed to basically be a welcoming community that any different person can involve themselves in. So it doesn't matter whether you're a volunteer, if you're a student who wants to basically program in order to gain some experience, or if you're working for a company, you should be welcomed into the community, and you should have the same access to be able to cooperate and collaborate with the rest of the community as everybody else. So there's no, because it's a multi-stakeholder project, there's no privileged company that's sitting behind it.
Sure.
So it's not like in some other open source projects where there's clearly a single company that's running the show, and they accept begrudgingly contributions from other companies, and they'll maybe even get you to sign a contributor's license agreement where you sign over all your rights. None of that is true in Inkscape. Essentially, when you commit code into the project, you retain the copyright, and you are a partial owner, right, of the actual code base.
Right. What happens if it's not a company, if it's general kind of user requests from everyday consumers that want to see this happen, but they're not, well-heeled like a company is to just fund? Because what you're proposing or what you operate on is kind of a patronage model, right? You have patrons who pay you, but then because of the wonderful thing that is the GPL license, you're obligated, but also they're obligated. They have no ownership over the work they've commissioned, which I think is wonderful. It benefits the community. What if it's little things that we all kind of want as everyday users, but no one's willing to step up and pay to get it done?
Yeah, so my traditional work as an independent contractor would obviously involve going to clients, medium and small businesses. But as I worked on Inkscape, it became increasingly clear that the needs of users in general wasn't being met.
Right.
And partially this is because, as I said, the Inkscape project itself primarily focuses on infrastructure and where it can increase the ability for other developers to do their work, right? They don't develop features. That's part of the charitable element, right? Like if you try to hire a charity to do work for your company, that would be a problem for them as a charity. So like they do have to have structures in place to deal with that. So I had to think about it, and I figured, you know what, we need to have a rethink about how we're doing some of this free and open source work, right? Because it isn't the case that it's just about open source developers needing support, right? There's a lot of emphasis placed on programmers need money in order to eat, this is a reasonable question, a reasonable, topic to bring up, but that's only half of the equation, right?
Mm-hmm.
The other side of the equation, which I think is equally important, needs to be stated every single time you talk about developers being paid. You have to talk about who is doing the paying and what constituency, or like the ability to make decisions, they then have in the project that they're funding, right?
Right.
So if you are a company, you have an easy in, right? You can, if you're Google and you want to modify something in Inkscape, you've got employees, right? You have a constituency, right? You can exercise your four freedoms, right? Including the freedom to modify. But if you're an artist in Brazil who uses Inkscape to do their work, and you're not a programmer yourself, you don't get to have that freedom, right? You don't get
Right.
to have the freedom to modify, and that's a problem, right? I come at the free and open source world from the politics side, right? I believe fundamentally that free and open source world works need to work, right? They need to function, because the alternative is not good. But if we're being honest with ourselves in the free and open source world, what we have is an economics problem, right? When you
Yes.
see a situation where the only people that get to take advantage of free and open source are either incredibly large corporations or programmers, and nobody else in between gets to access the buffet, that's a problem, right? That's a structural problem in the way that everything is organized.
Yes.
My diagnosis is that this is an economics problem, right? It's primarily about how users that use the thing are involved in the project themselves, right? Inviting users in to participate is one of those things that you can do. Some projects help with this by doing things like inviting people who are not programmers to cooperate with things like design, documentation, translations. These are all very, very effective, right? If somebody from the translations team came to me and said, hey, I have a bug in Inkscape, I'm far more likely to listen to their request because they're doing work on Inkscape, right? I can quid pro quo them a bug fix. But if you're just a random person from the internet and there are millions of Inkscape users, it's very difficult for me to pass my time and pay attention to everybody that needs attention.
Sure.
So what I did was I running essentially a multi-year business experiment. I have reduced my corporate clients, and I have introduced a public, basically a subscription, right? You can subscribe to me on Patreon or Ko-fi or LibrePay, and you as an individual are maybe only giving me $10 a month, but that money together with everybody else who's subscribed to me effectively pays for my time to work on Inkscape. And it isn't just, you're not just giving me money so I can eat, but you're doing that too. You're giving me money so that you can have some say. Not a lot, because it is a tiny fraction of but you do get a constituency vote into what I work on.
Yeah.
Right? And
I love that.
And it's true that like the people who have pushed me in certain directions have forced me to do things that I wouldn't have chosen to do as a volunteer, right? I wouldn't have focused on fixing Windows bugs by preference. I wouldn't have chosen to fix certain specific, should we say like paper cuts? Do you know what a paper cut is?
Like a minor problem, no?
It's a minor irritating problem. So it's basically a problem that you're seeing every day that just irritates you a little bit, but it's not enough to actually deal with by itself.
Sure.
But you take enough paper cuts and you have what's known as death by 1,000 paper cuts, right? It's like your project fails on that kind of design problem. And so attacking those small issues that people bring up, because they're my people, right? They're my supporters. They're paying me to work on the stuff that's important to them. And I think you see in the past few years that like people's responses to the direction that Inkscape has taken has steadily improved, especially as I have been allowed and paid to work on the stuff that's important to like non-corporate users.
Yes. There's a lot there that I want to unpack and a lot of different angles to come at this from, but I came before this from kind of the Bitcoin Lightning space, not the crypto space. I want to make very clear, like the Bitcoin Lightning space, because it is free and open source money, right? And it's that, right? It's everyone can submit a change and everyone has the same license over it. It is free and open source money. And a big concept there is value for value, right? Like the free in free and open source does not mean work for free. It means use for free, but it doesn't mean work for free. And there's that disconnect there, right? Which is just because you can use it for free doesn't mean you have to use it for free. And in 3D printing, I think money has become a taboo thing because everything is free and open source. And that's great. But at the end of the day, we need to understand that there is this disconnect, right? People need to be incentivized to focus on the things that we want them to focus on, not work a day job and then come home in moonlight.
Yeah, I mean, it's not. I mean, it's not just about like incentivizing. It's about attention.
Yes.
Right. Like I don't need to be incentivized to work on Inkscape. I'll do it.
Right.
It's just about making sure that there is a pathway for people to be able to contribute to the project through me. I'm like the vessel through which their
Right.
interaction with the project happens. The way I like to think about it is that free and open source isn't free; it's already paid for. Right? Somebody else paid, whether they paid their volunteer time or whether they paid real money. Somebody else paid to have this code made. The fact that you're using it for free doesn't negate the fact that it costs real-time resources and money to build, right?
Right.
And also maintain. And I think it's one of the holes that we currently have in our culture, that you have a lot of people who believe that they can use things that require maintenance, require improvements, and not contribute anything to them, as if they think that improvements and maintenance and stuff happens by magic, or like the fairies come and do it in the night. It's like, no, this is real human beings doing labor. And for me, it becomes a question of labor when you have like it doesn't have to be users. It can also be institutionalized. You can have expectations from maintainers of projects that they commit themselves to laboring for free, and that to me, as a socialist, is completely unacceptable. Right? Like you cannot enter a situation where a person who is a worker is forced to work for free. Right? It's a no-go. And like figuring out how to solve for that so that people aren't crushed in by essentially what is it, cultural expectations, and also a lack of infrastructure about how to collect money. Like, and I understand that like different projects of different layers in the open source cake are going to have different mechanisms, right? Libraries that are developed in Python can very easily take grants from both governments and large organizations, and it doesn't really affect too much what they work on because the library is focused. It's very simple. But for things that are user-facing, like Inkscape, where it's not that the Inkscape is delivered by some company to users. Users are actually taking it directly from us. Being able to invite them into the project, I think, is pretty much key. It's pretty much the whole ball game.
Yeah, I'm comforted because I have not thought about this nearly as much as you have, but kind of in my reflection, and you reached out after I published this video, open letter to the 3D printing community, and you're like, we've done a lot of thinking on this and let us experience share, which I so appreciated and so value. But I've not thought about this nearly as much as you have. And at the same time, that the solution that I came up with was really three things. One, we need to step up and support people on Patreon or whatever. It's, hey, if you want someone to prioritize the bug fix that you want, put your money where your mouth is. Two, I like the word that you used, expectation. You used it in a negative connotation, but if we have corporations using, right, like if Pixar was using Blender, making millions and millions and millions of dollars, and people didn't raise their eyebrow and say, are you supporting the Blender project? Like, I think we as consumers should have expectations of the people who are profiting from the work without contributing back. So we need to hold companies accountable. And then the third thing was, sorry, go ahead. I was just going to say the third thing is you've set an example where developers need to be comfortable saying, hey, I also have a mortgage to pay, and I really need people's support, because it's become taboo in a lot of open source circles.
Yeah,
At least in
people
ours, it is.
shouldn't be sacrificing themselves on the altar of
No.
like culture that doesn't respect them.
Yep.
Like your first goal, if you want to help and improve the world, is to make sure that you're on a sure footing yourself. If you're not, you
Archimedes said that.
fall.
Yep.
If you fall because you're in a weak position, you will not be able to help anybody.
Yep.
So, like, I understand the desire to help first, but as they say on the airplane, put your mask on before you help somebody else put theirs on.
I
Right?
completely agree.
Like,
Completely agree.
this doesn't entitle you to greed. We're not talking avarice. We're talking the capacity to be able to do the work. Yeah, I noticed that you mentioned Pixar. Pixar's actually really interesting because they do open source work. They make
Right.
a project, I believe it's called RenderMan.
Mm-hmm.
So like the corporations do open source work. It's just that the difference between a single corporation project and a multi-stakeholder one is very obvious when you think
Yeah.
about it. A good example, though not a good situation, is Mozilla, because
Mm-hmm.
they are not really a very good multi-stakeholder project, right? They're basically what happens to an open source project when it fails to be a good
Right.
multi-stakeholder project. They are essentially a single money sourced project where their culture has been so bound up in the way that venture capital works in Silicon Valley that they no longer can see the wood for the trees, essentially, for what is what a project needs to focus on, right? Like the independent contractor or the company can focus on the features and the things and the deliverables, the designs, all of this cool stuff. But the project itself, the core of it, needs to actually think about the community. It needs to think about keeping the doors open, keeping everything accessible, making sure that spaces are moderated and that spaces exist at all, right? So like this community management stuff is key if you want to be able to grow the commercial aspects on top of it. If you do the commercial aspects first, what you end up with is basically corporatized. It's very easy for it to be captured, and you end up with a single stakeholder, which is fine for them, but this
Right.
doesn't necessarily mean that they're actually delivering for the people that need them to.
Right. And there are so many projects out there that are open source, but the onus of maintenance has fallen on one company, right? That's Prusa Slicer. Slicer became Prusa Slicer. It's open source, but Prusa's carrying the burden. And then fortunately it's been forked out and now other people are doing cool things which are going backwards. So they can have new life, they can be resurrected. But I think the world is littered with open source projects. I use one every day that kind of nobody there was no Martin who stood up and said, I'll be the one to kind of like lead the charge. It's called Quicksilver for Mac. It's
Okay.
a task launcher. Oh, it's the best thing ever. And I can't live without it, but they stopped developing it like 10 years ago. So,
Oh.
um,
Was it open
speaking,
source?
it is open source. Yeah, I'm pretty
It is
sure.
open source.
I mean, it's free and you can look at it on GitHub. I don't know what the license is, but I'm pretty sure that makes it open source if it's on GitHub, right?
No.
No.
Microsoft are actually very lax about making sure that the projects that are on GitHub are properly licensed. If there's no license there, you should consider it all rights reserved. Like, don't even touch it.
Right. Okay. That's another topic we can get into. I do need to take a quick
Eh,
break and
Not all.
thank my corporate sponsor who makes this possible, and that is PCBWay. You guys know PCBWay. They are your one-stop shop for all things prototyping. If you don't have a 3D printer, but you want to get something 3D printed, or you want it 3D printed out of aluminum or tool steel or titanium, you want it CNC machined out of tungsten, or you just want some custom PCBs for your next project, PCBWay has you covered. They are fantastic. I have all kinds of stuff around me that is made by them. I always share the example of my 3D printed tool steel custom bit, which has a hex on one side and a Phillips on the other, because you can't buy such a thing. And I just think it's the coolest thing that I can order that and have it FedEx to me in a matter of days. So check out the link in the description or go to jlewi/PCBWay. I've done a lot of ad reads for PCBWay. I just have them. I can like do them in my sleep because they are our longest running sponsor, and they literally pay my rent in the studio. So thank you, PCBWay.
Yeah, I mean, we can talk about how sponsorship actually works when, because I've been
Right.
sponsored, like people are paying me, but sometimes people pay me in a more indirect way. Like the computer that I'm currently using was bought for me by System 76. I did shout outs in my videos to thank them for helping me do my work.
Right.
They, as a company, they use Inkscape, so they are users. They're not just doing it for the ad reads. But it's important to know that like your relationship with people who develop software doesn't have to be money. Money's good.
Right.
Money is like a really useful way to do it, and it can be organized in a very interesting way. But your relationship
Yeah.
could be basically based on anything. If you're best mates with a programmer and they have a skill that you need, you can just ask them. You don't have to join their Patreon. You could just be like, "Hey, Bob, could you like fix this thing for me?" That's done through your relationship, right?
Right.
And thinking about uh, the resistance to commercialization is mostly about how relationships themselves become less important, right? That like interpersonal relationships become less important and become, more corporate, less
Yeah.
uh, true or honest. But that doesn't have to be the case. Many people who have worked on Inkscape have done things quid pro quo. The people that worked on my graphics for my videos, they gave me bugs to fix, and I fixed them in exchange for the work that they helped me do. Right? That's not something that you can account for in your
Right.
Patreon spreadsheet or whatever. But
Yeah.
I consider them to be equally valid contributions and equally valid
Sure.
support.
Sure.
Um, and while barter is a really hard way to do things, it's very rare.
Yes and no. I mean, you
Not
need the
impossible.
computer to do your work, and it would have been money out of pocket. It's
Yeah,
in kind is called in kind because it's
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 yeah,
it's in kind, right? It is in the
yeah,
kind of thing. Since I put out my video, I've been chatting with so many independent hardware developers and realizing like a lot of them, it's insult and injury. Like they're doing the work for free, publishing the files for free because that's the license they're developing on an open source protocol like a Voron. And then they're spending money out of pockets to buy all the latest hardware to make sure that their design fits. So I've just been connecting all these designers to LDO Motors and E3D, who all, to their credit, have been so awesome. And they're like, yeah, of course we'll send over free parts so they don't have to pay out of pocket to make their
yeah.
designs adaptable. So more people can buy our designs because they're now adapted to this new, project. So that's been a really, really cool thing for me to just be able to connect people and be like, yeah, okay, buying this hot end would cost you $150, but you're doing all this work for free,
Yeah.
And it's of benefit to these companies for their design, for their products to be
Absolutely.
adapted to more things. So that's a really cool point. I do want to change gears real quick, and I want to give you the opportunity as someone who's gone through this. You're kind of in the role that many designers who I hope are listening to this, who are designing, the next 3D printer or the next multicolor upgrade or the next tool head. I know Nadir is in the chat here who's developing all these tool heads and dreams of doing this full time. Like, what's the advice that you would give to them, either in marketing themselves or in seeking out corporate patrons, or in what things they should focus on in order to be able to sustain themselves working on an open source project where, Voron is analogous to Inkscape? Voron is
Yeah,
an
I
open
would.
source 3D printer. I don't know if you know that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I think making sure that you understand that the work that you do to grow your business is work, and it's for your business, right? So first of all, you have to think about the work that you're doing as a business, even if it's just 10 hours a week. If you're hoping to grow and do community contributions and other various things, you have to be all in on conceptually understanding that your investment into your own business is that it's an investment, right? You're going to spend time developing outreach, you're going to spend time doing community management, you're going to spend time figuring out what it is that your customers or people that are in the community really need and how you can address that.
Yep.
um, I would say that like making sure that you have a clear policy in your project, in your open source project when it comes to commercial interaction can really, really help. So this is about making sure that if you're a single developer who has a project that you created, then you're kind of in a privileged position, right? But if you're hoping to actually grow beyond just you, and you like the idea of a multi-stakeholder project so that there are multiple companies, multiple people involved in it, you have to start thinking about what is just and fair when it comes to both interacting with the code, interacting with the designs, and most importantly, interacting with the brand, right? I highly recommend that people think about the brand for their project as a precious resource that should have proper policy put around it in terms of who is allowed to use it and when, who can claim to be the project and when, and how you can distinguish yourself as being promoted by, supported by, integrated, officially a part of some offshoot, like I am officially able to provide the services that I am as a part of the community. Like basically your ability to communicate that you have a good, solid reputation with the upstream project, right?
Oh man, this is
So
gold. This is so valuable.
if you don't, and you end up basically not having the policy in place, you will I think end up with recriminations and hurt feelings, people taking without knowing where the lines are. This has happened before. Just have a look at the difficulties that Collabra have with LibreOffice. Just have a look at like a lot of companies who have tried to interact with open source projects and failed because like there's not a good model there for how a corporation has a lot of power behind it. It can have a lot of money behind it, and that for a project can be very threatening and can overpower volunteers very, very easily. So there has to be a way in which you can think about the community that you're trying to hold as a multi-stakeholder project, and also how people with power and money and influence can interact fairly with the project, right? So everybody understands that everybody is on the same footing, right?
This is so on point and so salient. We just had a kerfuffle in the community where so the Voron project is an open source, fully open source 3D printer. Voron is a trademark, but the design is fully open source. One of the companies I work with, Soval, decided to create a commercial printer based on the open source design and say it is inspired by the Voron 2.4. So they have to give credit. That's part of the license, but you can't use the name Voron in your marketing. So there's this fine line of unclear. And they said, we're going to be donating for every one we sell. We don't have to. They don't. It's an open source design. They could have copied it blatantly and sold it and been well within the license, as long as they don't call it a Voron. But there was a kerfuffle in the community because people are like, oh, this isn't fair. Wait, is it fair? You know, people weren't clear about it. Yeah. And I'm saying now from a point of understanding, because we dug into it as a community, and someone on the Voron team spoke up and said, hey, I don't know anything about a donation, but they definitely can't use the Voron name. It's like, well, wait, how do you give attribution? You have to give attribution. So it was this whole thing where we realized, like, who is authorized to say that this is okay? Who isn't? How do they want us to give attribution? Do they want us to give attribution? Are you allowed to advertise that you're donating to the project, or is that using the brand? And it was a whole thing. The community sorted it out. It's all good now. Soval donated. The Voron team was appreciative. It's great. Everything's awesome. But it was a kerfuffle because, you know, it just had never been specified.
Yeah.
To your point, there were no clear policies.
Yeah, I think it's people should be open to creativity when it comes to licensing trademarks, right? So you have to think about the code and also the open hardware designs as one set of licenses, and the trademark as another set of licenses.
Totally.
And there is just as much policy and legal and lawyers that can be involved in the trademark policy making as there is ever discussion about the license for the code, right? For the copyright. And I think that, you know, you if you want to be able to say, the project, a commercial entity that wants to sell it and say this type of thing that they are inspired by or they're based on this design, we expect to see, you know, a 10% donation.
Right.
Well, not donation at this point; it's payment.
Right.
Payment, because it's not voluntary.
Right.
we expect to see a 10% of possibly not revenue, possibly profit, like be put back into the project, right? We expect you to commit to investing back into the project in order to be able to use the trademark in this way. And obviously with lawyers, they would design a trademark agreement that contained all of the lines that people can meet, so that the companies are not left guessing or trying to take too much from a project.
Right. And we had another interesting situation the other day, and I hope no one who was involved minds me saying this, but I was talking to Nadir, and he's doing a tool changer design for his tool head that's based on DraftShift's design. And he and I were debating, and he was like, I made sure to leave their logo on the parts, which I remixed to fit my tool head, so people know that I'm giving them credit. And I come and I'm like, that if I were them and you were using their logo on your design of their product, I would be pissed. Well, I checked with them and they're like, no, we use the logo. It's super cool to see our logo for our project on a new remix and adaptation. But there was this moment of like, maybe put that in the GitHub, right? If you're going to remix it, please keep the logo, or you're free to keep the logo. You don't have to keep the logo. So it's like, it's not clear, right? Is this the right thing to do, or is this appropriation? So I loved your points.
We had a similar situation, right? So like Chris Rogers made a beautiful Inkscape book, physical book, and he did a ton of work on writing it. And he had to go to the Software Freedom Conservancy and just make sure that like he was allowed to use the Inkscape logo and name in the context of how it's written, right? It's called, what is it called? Design Made Easy with Inkscape, right? Like that trademark is being used on the book. The name itself, the SFC said, was not necessarily a problem. Like if you write a book about a thing, you're not claiming to be the thing, right? So as far as I understand it, there's not really a lot that you can do to restrict somebody from using a mark to say,
from mentioning your mark,
mentioning that you're right, like you are writing about this thing. It's not, but using the logo is a different matter, right? Because now when we have a graphical mark, it's way more expressive. It creates an endorsement or a what do they call it? Implication of endorsement, right? And that should be, I think, done with permission with the project.
Yeah. Now, I want to ask about the Software Conservancy, because recently I was chatting with the Enraged Rabbit Carrot Feeder team. They're, just to fill you in for the non-super geeky 3D printing folk, they've developed an open source material switcher for the Voron project, which is also an open source project. It's an open source project of an open source project. And then there are a million different offshoots of that and adaptations. And I was telling them, it's kind of really hard to support you guys, because I want to support not only the base project, but the 15 other people developing things that are optional add-ons to it. And we were toying with this idea of, what if you created a fund? And it sounds like that's what the Software Conservancy is. Do you think that that's the right model going forward, where there's a Voron Developer Conservancy Fund, and they're divvying out funds to projects and preserving the trademark and people who have interesting ideas for taking the hardware further? Or because that inherently becomes, you now have some stakeholders with significantly more power than others.
Yes. Yeah, so the Software Freedom Conservancy is a 501(c) charity organization.
Right.
So it acts as an umbrella organization for many other projects, for instance, Git. And so they handle a lot of money in and out. They consider themselves to be taking in donations and then paying for the things that the projects themselves need.
Yeah.
When those things are in the public interest, right? So if I ask the SFC to pay for a new fridge, they would say, no, that's not in the public interest. If I ask them to pay for me to develop connectors functionality, if the project was like, okay, they might do it, but they might also turn around and say, look, connector stuff is cool and all, but like there are companies that can pay for that. Like that's not in the public interest for them to fund that. But if we said, hey, can you pay for a new chatting system so that like developers can get together and chat about stuff, there would be absolutely no problem with that at all, right? If we want to buy T-shirts to encourage participation and like get people involved in a project, or pay for students to be involved through Google Summer of Code or Outreachy, no problem with that at all, right? So it's a different set of levels of like, is this really for the public interest? But that's
Right.
because they're a charity, right? They have a set of policies about what they're trying to achieve. For other organizations, they can choose what it is and how they're organizing things. Blender is a good example, right? They have a non-profit that organizes most of their development, and I believe most Blender development is done by the Blender Foundation, right? But
Right.
it doesn't mean that like people aren't involved. They have ways of getting control over the project into the project.
Mm-hmm.
When you have a situation where people are donating money and not having a voice, it basically means that that central organization, charity or otherwise, is basically washing the money, right? They're basically washing the quid pro quo, the return for keeping stuff running. And maybe that's okay. Maybe you trust the people who are running it to be on the ball and look after your interests. But you also have to be concerned with the fact that like if there's no documented sense that they will be paying attention to the people who are donating to them, or they will be paying attention to people who are paying for stuff to happen. Like that needs to be properly worked out as well.
Right. And I think one of the challenges is, as you mentioned, right, it's what's in the public good and fixing things. Whereas I think what I'm talking about is it's almost like a mini incubator or venture fund for the next things that are, some of them are
Oh
moonshots,
yeah.
some of them won't work out.
Oh, so this is a different kind of funding where we're talking about
Right.
experimental and yeah. I'm not entirely sure. I haven't investigated very much into how um, either group funding or the kind of funding that I do interacts with speculative work. Speculative work can be very difficult. I've had work that I've done on Inkscape fail before, and it's hard because you don't have enough resources. You can't meet the actual needs. But there's always hope that you can bring it back. But that's as far as I've ever gotten into speculative stuff.
Yeah. It
Have
is
you
an
have you heard of
interesting thing.
the Open Collective?
No.
The Open Collective is an organization. I think it's a 501c. I don't know. It's a slightly different type of organization, and it effectively collects money and then gives it out to developers. It's a much more
Mm,
direct way where the SFC manages what is spent. The Open Collective doesn't, right? They basically say, okay, there are 8 registered developers with this Open Collective project. You donate through the Open Collective monthly, da da da. They pay out an equal share to all of those members, right?
mhm.
So that particular model works for some projects because they have
Right.
an organization, they're like the Open Collective, that's doing all of that business work of collecting money, of having
Yeah.
Stripe accounts, doing all of that legwork, and all they get in each month is an amount of money directly from their users, and they can use that to spend time on their projects.
I also wonder, if, there's data and there's metrics and there's analytics here. Like, for example, I'm just thinking out loud here. Say we had a Voron development fund, right? And it's like for all cool projects being developed, branching off of this wonderful open source project called Voron. And you have branches off of branches off of branches. Like we go down deep into the weeds, right? We all subscribe on Patreon, to your point, right? Patreon or wherever, coffee. And then what if it's just distributed in the same way that Spotify distributes, right? Or Skillshare, which is downloads. The more, I mean, people, you need obviously people to be upstanding and not game the system. But if 10,000 people download the Enraged Rabbit Carrot Feeder multi-material system, and then only 1,000 people download this modification, you just do a monthly distribution of that fund. I think that's an interesting idea, assuming people conduct themselves, ethically.
I think that one of the topics that should be considered is what's known as channel control, right? So if you are Microsoft and you want to
Mhm.
basically make sure that you're the only people who can sell computers, you essentially control all of the people that sell computers and say to them, hey, we're going to give you some money if you only sell Windows machines. Right?
Mhm.
They call it advertising funds. There is other get outs, but it's essentially bribes for controlling the marketplace. This actually happens in software using app stores.
Mhm.
So there are open source projects that actually do channel control themselves. If you want to use OSM, which is an open source project for maps on Android, if you get it through F-Droid, it's free. F-Droid can't take money. It's just available because it's open source. If you get it through Google, it actually costs money. You cannot get it through Google for free, right? That's because the OSM project, there's nothing about the open source licenses or model that requires you to give stuff for free in the most convenient way possible, right? If you want to deliver things on the Google App Store and you want to say, hey, the deal is, the social contract is, you give us some money and we look after this thing, and we keep developing it, but like you give us some money. Like that's a thing that you can do, right? There's nothing
Right.
against the way in which the morality works out fine, the economics work out better, and the project actually has a sure footing, right? That is a commercialization. There is a sense like you have to be able to trust the people that are receiving the money to be able to prioritize the things that the users who are paying for it through Google actually want. Usually what you end up with is a pretty good distribution on that platform. Like if Inkscape, for example, sold, instead of giving Windows users on the Microsoft App Store, if you could buy Inkscape for $20, we would be able to actually hire a Windows developer directly, and the Windows version of Inkscape would probably work a lot better, right? Because we would want to make sure it continued to function for the Microsoft App Store.
Right.
So that's called channel control, where you basically you understand that the way in which people can access things conveniently is through this mechanism, right? Critter sells Critter on Steam, right? You can go to
Mhm.
Steam and buy open source, right, for money, and they get a decent chunk of change that they pay their developers with.
Mhm. Mhm. There's some debate in the chat here that's a little bit distracting because people are now wondering if you have a 3D printer yet, and they're debating whether the Inkscape icon on your shirt is 3D printed.
So it is 3D printed,
Okay.
but I didn't 3D print it.
Okay. Okay.
So my good friend, I think, was this one of Chris Rogers' ones? Yeah, I think when he came to a Hackfest, he gave me this one, and I put some screws in the back and made it magnetic,
Nice.
and I'm using a
So
magnet.
good job, Underhill. You guys managed to completely distract me because the minute they said that, I was like, is it 3D printed? But
Yeah.
let me ask, what has prevented you from getting into 3D printing? As someone who's obviously interested in the intersection between technology and creativity.
I mean, partially it's space. Just there's a lot of machines, a lot of hardware. A lot of the stuff that I get to play with is more software based, and that does keep me quite busy.
Yeah.
As I said before, I do have a scan and cut, so I'm not completely outside of the CNC space.
Yep.
And I have been doing things with like resin molding and other things. Like I did a chocolate bar project,
Okay.
which involved me doing a design in Inkscape and then getting a 3D printed model of it, and then using the model as the positive to then create a rubber mold,
Sure.
and then essentially using the rubber mold to create chocolate bars.
No kidding. All right. You couldn't 3D print the mold because it wouldn't be food safe. Yeah, that makes sense.
I mean, it's also like it's more flexible because rubber you can.
Sure.
I don't know what the material sciences are currently at when it comes to 3D printing like rubber,
Right.
but like there's a whole bunch of
different TPU, but it still wouldn't be food safe. You would still want the silicone to ultimately be what contacts the food.
And people said to me like, why don't you just print the chocolate? And I looked at it and I'm
Can
like,
do that.
because it's really bad chocolate.
And it's really slow. It's
It's
very, very
really bad. So I got into like the brands of chocolate and like how it was made and buying
sure.
it directly from the from couvertures and like, and so I had already I knew what flavors I wanted in the chocolate bars, so I couldn't use anything that had melting points of a specific
Right.
degree.
That makes
So
sense.
while this process had more steps to it, I ended up with a much better, I think, product at the end.
Yeah, that's fair. That's fair. And it sounds like you just don't have time to tinker with 3D printers and learn one more hobby.
I- I'll admit that like I bartered with my friend Chris Rogers. He did the 3D print for me,
Yeah,
and then I fixed two Inkscape bugs in exchange.
yeah. It probably would have been cheaper to just get your own 3D printer, considering how much
It could have
a
been.
programming hour costs these days. But fair enough. Well, Martin, I want to thank you for coming on the show. This has been fascinating. I think you've given all of us, myself included, some food for thought on how we as a community can move forward and solve some of these problems, as you said, economic problems. And it's good to know that we're not the only community that's faced this and that there's light at the end of the tunnel as well.
Yeah, yeah. I'm very happy that you give me this opportunity to share some of these ideas. I think that these
Absolutely.
ideas are more valuable when more people can think about them, because we are in the open source world, even in the software world, still trying to develop this economic relationship that we have with our users.
Absolutely. Well, let's keep in touch. I'd love to have you on again in the future. And thanks again for coming on.
Thanks, Jonathan.
All right. Let me find the end stream button. And thanks